I hosted my 70th birthday party inside the building I had spent 7 years of my life creating. More than 200 guests were raising their glasses when at exactly 9:15 p.m., the fire alarm screamed. Black smoke poured into the grand hall, and every eastern emergency exit locked shut. Amid the panic and screams, my son stood beside the control panel, looked at me coldly, and smirked. "Your old dad. Tonight the company, the building, even your name, they all belong to me now." That was when I realized this was never an ordinary fire. Thank you for being here. It genuinely means everything. Now tell me in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Your city, your country? I want to know. Note this story includes fictional elements for entertainment and educational purposes. Names and settings are coincidental. The lesson, however, is one worth holding on to. My name is Arthur Sterling. I am 70 years old, and the night everything changed, I was standing in the most beautiful room I had ever built, holding a glass of champagne I never got to drink. The Glass Cathedral had taken me 3 years to design and 4 more to build. It sat in the heart of downtown Chicago like a statement, floor-to-ceiling glass panels, steel arches that curved like ribs, a lobby that caught the evening light and broke it into 1,000 directions. People stopped on the sidewalk outside just to look at it. I had designed hospitals and universities and concert halls across 4 decades, but this building was different. This one I had built for myself. Tonight, it was dressed for a celebration. 200 guests filled the main hall, senators, developers, old colleagues, and the kind of people whose names you read in the business section. My 70th birthday, the invitation had said. A milestone worth marking. Julian found me near the entrance just before 9 o'clock. My son was 42 years old and looked every inch the man I had hoped he would become. Tall, composed, wearing a suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He smiled when he saw me, and for a moment I felt the specific pride that only a father can feel. "Dad," he said, clasping my hand. "You look tired. Are you sure you're up for all this?" "I built this room," I told him. "I can stand in it for one night." He laughed. It was a good laugh, warm, easy. But something made me pause. I had known my son's laugh for 42 years. I knew the way his eyes moved when something genuinely amused him. Tonight, his eyes didn't move that way. They were still, watchful, like a man waiting for something he already knew was coming. I told myself I was imagining things. I was 70 years old and prone to reading shadows where there weren't any. I let go of his hand and turned back toward my guests. At 9:15, the fire alarm went off. At first, no one moved. Fire alarms at formal events are almost always a false trigger. A caterer getting too close to a heat sensor, a cigarette in a bathroom. People looked at each other with polite irritation. A few set down their glasses. Then came the smoke. It rolled in from the direction of the technical floor, thick, black, and fast. Not the thin gray of an electrical short. This was the kind of smoke that meant something was genuinely burning. I moved toward the nearest emergency exit on instinct. I have inspected the safety systems of every building I have ever designed. It is a habit so deep it is closer to a reflex. The exit was a heavy fire door on the eastern wall. I reached it, grabbed the push bar, and shoved. It didn't move. I shoved again, harder. Nothing. The door was locked, not stuck, not stiff, but electronically sealed. The indicator light above the frame that should have been green was dark. Around me, the room was changing. The polite confusion was curdling into something uglier. A woman screamed. A man knocked over a table trying to reach a window. I moved to the next exit, then the next. Every door on the eastern side was sealed. "Move back from the walls," I shouted. "Stay low, don't run." 40 years of designing evacuation routes meant I knew exactly what I was doing, and I knew exactly how wrong this was. Emergency exits in a building with an active fire alarm are supposed to unlock automatically. The system that controlled those locks had been overridden. Somebody had turned it off on purpose. The sprinklers activated 4 minutes later. 4 minutes too late to stop the panic, too late to prevent the injuries, as people pushed toward the few exits that were working on the western side. In those 4 minutes, over 40 guests were hurt. Senator Robert Caldwell, who I had known for 15 years, broke his wrist against a sealed doorframe. A real estate developer named Frank Briggs suffered a serious burn to his forearm. When the doors finally opened and the crowd pushed through into the cold Chicago night, I turned back toward the building. Through the smoke and the emergency lighting and the sound of sirens already converging on the block, I looked across the open space toward the service corridor. Julian was standing at the edge of the lighted area near the emergency access panel. He had his phone in his hand. He was not running. He was not shouting. He was not looking for me. He was watching. Then he stepped close enough for only me to hear. "Look around, Dad," he whispered. "This room, this company, even your name. By morning, none of it will belong to you." That was when the smoke stopped feeling like an accident. Our eyes met across the distance, maybe 50 feet, maybe more. His expression did not change. No relief at seeing his father standing, no urgency, no fear. He looked at me the way a person looks at a building they are about to knock down. Measuring. Finished with it. A trap closing. I have designed hundreds of structures in my lifetime. I understand what happens when the load-bearing elements fail. And standing there in the smoke of my own creation, I felt something I had never felt in 40 years of building, the distinct, unmistakable sensation of the ground giving way beneath my feet. Not because the building was falling, because I finally understood what my son had done. The emergency room at Northwestern Memorial smelled like antiseptic and burnt fabric. My jacket, the one I had been wearing when I pulled Senator Caldwell away from the sealed door, was ruined at the left shoulder, where a piece of falling ceiling tile had caught it. A nurse had offered me a hospital gown in exchange. I told her I was fine. I was not fine. But that was a separate problem. I had been sitting in the same plastic chair for 2 hours when Marcus Webb walked through the double doors. Marcus had been my closest colleague for 30 years, a structural engineer who had worked alongside me on 11 major projects, a man who had seen every version of my professional life and never once flinched. He was 64, broad-shouldered, and moved through the world with the steady deliberateness of someone who had spent his career making sure things did not fall down. He didn't say hello. He just held out his phone. The headline was already trending. Sterling Patriarch watched as his own building burned. Eyewitnesses described deliberate negligence. Below it was a 45-second video clip. The footage showed me standing near the service corridor, with the building lit up behind me, smoke billowing past the glass panels. The camera angle was low and tight, the kind of framing that made the distance between me and the burning building seem like comfortable observation rather than desperate assessment. "I watched it twice. That footage is wrong," I said. "I was trying to find Leo. My grandson was outside with his drone before everything started." "Arthur." Marcus sat down next to me. His voice was quiet. "Nobody's going to see it that way." He was right. I knew he was right the moment I said it. The clip had been posted at 6 in the morning before most people were awake, before any official statement, before any of my team had a chance to respond. Whoever had released it had timed it to land first, to become the story, before any other version existed. I looked at the footage one more time. The angle was fixed, deliberate, not a guest's shaking handheld video, not the frantic recording of someone in a panic. It was steady, pre-positioned. "Who has access to the building's external camera system?" I asked. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "The communications director. That's the only person with full external feed access outside of your technical team." "Sloane," I said. Sloane was the head of communications at Sterling Architecture Group. Julian had brought her in 2 years ago, bypassing the standard hiring committee, which I had noted at the time and said nothing about. She was good at her job, or at least she appeared to be. I had never found a reason to look harder. I was looking harder now. My phone buzzed. Julian's name on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. Dad. His voice was practiced warm, concerned the exact calibration of a son who had just heard about a disaster. God, I'm so relieved you're okay. This is getting completely out of control. Let me handle the press. You just rest. I'm not resting, Julian. You're in the hospital. You need to. I'm sitting in the emergency room waiting area. I'm not admitted. I'm not injured. I kept my voice even. Tell me about the video. A pause. Short, but there. What video? The one that's been running on every major outlet since 6 this morning. The one that was filmed from a stationary position before the alarm went off. Another pause longer this time. Dad, I haven't seen everything that's circulating. There's a lot of content out there right now, and most of it is completely irresponsible. That's exactly why you need to let me manage. Julian. I stopped him. Who positioned that camera? The line went quiet in a way that told me everything. Not dead air thinking air. The specific silence of a man choosing his next words carefully. Get some rest, he said finally. We'll talk later. He hung up. I set the phone face down on my knee and looked at Marcus. He had heard enough from my side of the conversation to follow it. He knew about the video, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. He knew about the video. I agreed. I sat with that for a moment, not the anger of it, not the hurt of it, just the plain factual weight of it. My son had stood outside a burning building with 200 people trapped inside. He had filmed it. He had released the footage before dawn to shape the story before I could speak. I thought about something else. Leo had been outside with his drone before the fire started. A child's toy that he'd been pointing at the party lights. A drone with a camera. Marcus, I said slowly, before you do anything else tonight, find out where Leo's drone is. Don't mention it to anyone. Not Julian's staff, not the building management. Nobody. Marcus looked at me. Why does the drone matter? I didn't answer right away. I was thinking about angles, about positions, about a 10-year-old boy pointing a camera upward at a building his grandfather had built at the exact moment his father was standing near a door he had no business standing near. Because Julian forgot about it, I said. And that might be the only thing he forgot. Marcus nodded slowly, the way he always did when he understood something, without needing it fully explained. He stood, pocketed his phone, and walked back toward the exit. I sat alone in the plastic chair. The antiseptic smell was sharp and clean. Outside, the Chicago morning was already fully lit, and somewhere on the other side of the city, a story was being written about me that I had not authored. My phone buzzed one more time. Not Julian. An unknown number. A text message 4 words long. Mr. Sterling, meet me, S. I read it 3 times. The initial S could belong to a dozen people. But something about the timing, the precision of it arriving at exactly this moment, made me set the phone down very carefully on my knee and think. Someone else was watching, and they had chosen right now to reach out. The text message from S was still sitting unanswered in my phone when Monday morning arrived. 2 days had passed since the fire, 2 days of news cycles and insurance adjusters and a public relations firm Julian had hired without consulting me. I had spent Sunday alone in my penthouse watching the city move below and thinking about angles. By the time I walked into the Sterling Architecture Group boardroom at 8:45, I had made a decision. Not about what to do next, about what not to do. The room felt different. 40 years I had sat at the head of that table, the same table I had chosen myself, a 12-foot slab of reclaimed oak that I had sourced from a demolition site in Milwaukee. This morning, Julian was already seated at the far end. Not the middle. The far end. My end. He didn't stand when I walked in. Daniel Hurst, the company's senior legal counsel, rose from his chair and extended a hand. Hearst was 60 years old, silver-haired, and had worked for the company for 11 years. He had always struck me as a competent man whose primary loyalty was to whoever signed his retainer. This morning, that much was confirmed. "Mr. Sterling," he said, "thank you for coming in." "It's my company, Daniel," I said. "I don't need an invitation." He didn't respond to that. He simply sat back down and opened the leather portfolio in front of him. The ethics clause, as Hearst explained it, was a provision embedded in Sterling Architecture Group's corporate bylaws, a clause I had approved myself years ago as a protective measure against the kind of scandal that could drag a firm's reputation into the ground. Under its terms, the board of directors held the authority to suspend the executive rights and voting privileges of any officer credibly accused of conduct harmful to the company's public standing. Not a termination, not a forced sale, a suspension pending investigation. The video of me standing outside a burning building, circulated to every major outlet before dawn, constituted in the board's opinion sufficient grounds. "You're stripping me of operational control over the company I built," I said. "Temporarily suspending your executive authority," Hearst corrected carefully. "Your ownership position remains intact. However, given the circumstances, Given the circumstances," Julian said from the far end of the table, "the board believes a clean transition of operational authority is in the company's best interest." He folded his hands. "I've already drafted a buyout proposal. Fair market value adjusted for current conditions." Current conditions. The company's private valuation had dropped 41% since Saturday morning. The adjusted fair market value he was proposing was less than a third of what my stake had been worth 5 days ago. "You want me to sell?" I said. "At a 30-year low you manufactured." Julian held my gaze. "I want this resolved quickly. For the company. For the family." He paused. "If you choose to fight this in court, that's your right. But litigation takes 18 months minimum. In 18 months, the Glass Cathedral sits in legal limbo. The clients we have in pipeline walk, and the story about you standing outside that fire runs every time a reporter needs a column inch." He wasn't wrong. That was the calculation he was counting on me to make, and he was right that I was making it. But he was wrong about why. I picked up the pen. "I built this company from a 2-man office on the north side," I said. "I designed the building we're sitting in right now. I chose this table." I looked at him not with anger, because anger is a luxury I couldn't afford that morning. "I just want you to know that, Julian, whatever you think you're taking, I want you to know exactly what it is." He said nothing. I signed. Daniel collected the documents with practiced efficiency. Julian buttoned his jacket and extended a hand across the table. I did not take it. I simply picked up my briefcase, nodded once at Marcus, who had been sitting against the wall in silence, and walked out. In the elevator, Marcus stood beside me without speaking. The doors closed. The floors counted down. "You gave it away," Marcus said quietly. "I gave him what he thinks he wants," I said. "There's a difference." Marcus looked at me. He had known me long enough to hear what I wasn't saying. He didn't push. When we reached the lobby and stepped out onto Wacker Drive, I finally pulled out my phone. The message from S was still there. 4 words. I typed back 2. "When, where?" The reply came 40 minutes later, a coffee shop in Wicker Park, tomorrow morning at 7. I spent the rest of Monday afternoon in my penthouse doing what I had always done when a project was falling apart. I sat down and tried to understand the full structural load before I touched anything. That was when Sloane called. I knew the name. Julian had hired her as director of communications 2 years earlier, a decision that had bypassed the standard hiring committee entirely, which I had flagged once in a board memo and let drop when Julian dismissed it. She was sharp, visible, and effective at her job. Beyond that, I had never had reason to look closer. Her voice on the phone was not what I expected. I had anticipated defensive or calculated or smoothly professional. Instead, she sounded like someone reading from a document, precise, stripped of anything unnecessary. Mr. Sterling, I was at Rossi's penthouse this afternoon. I was there when Julian arrived. I think you need to hear what happened. I moved to the window and stood with my back to the room. I'm listening. She told me she had been brought along as part of Julian's team for what was framed internally as a partnership meeting. Vincenzo Rossi, she explained his name without my asking, as though she understood. I needed context was a real estate developer operating primarily out of River North, known for casino resort projects in the Midwest and Southeast. He was 63 years old, Italian-born, and had spent the last decade acquiring distressed commercial properties in markets where local governments were hungry enough for tax revenue to ask few questions. Julian had apparently been in contact with Rossi for months. The meeting today was not exploratory. The contracts were already drafted. Julian walked in thinking he was closing a deal, Sloane said. Rossi let him sign everything. Then he put a second set of documents on the table. What kind of documents? Debt instruments. A complete list of Julian's personal loans, the ones he'd taken out over the past 3 years to quietly accumulate minority shares in the company. Every single one of those loans had been purchased by Rossi's holding companies. Julian borrowed the money from 6 different private lenders. He didn't know Rossi had bought the paper on all of them. I understood immediately what that meant. When a lender sells a loan to a third party, the borrower's obligation transfers entirely to the new holder. Julian had spent 3 years leveraging himself to position against me, and without realizing it, he had borrowed every dollar of that leverage from a man who was now his primary creditor. Rossi told him directly, I asked. He poured champagne first, Sloane said. Then he slid the documents across the table and said, I'm quoting, "You didn't acquire your father's company, Julian. You just moved into my house." I said nothing for a moment. How did Julian respond? He shook Rossi's hand. He drank the champagne. She paused. His hand was shaking when he picked up the glass. I turned away from the window. Across the room on the shelf near the fireplace, there was a photograph Julian at 6 years old sitting on my shoulders at the groundbreaking of my first major commission, squinting into the sun, grinning like the world was something that had been built specifically for him. I looked away from it. You were in that room, I said. You watched all of this, and then you called me. Yes. Why? The pause that followed was not evasive. It was the pause of someone deciding how honest to be. Because watching Julian walk out of there thinking he'd won when he'd actually just handed Rossi everything, I realized the timeline I'd been working on was wrong. She stopped. There are things you don't know about me, Mr. Sterling. Things that matter to why I'm calling. Then tell me. Another pause. Shorter this time. Not over the phone, she said. Tomorrow, 7 o'clock, Wicker Park. The line went quiet. I stood in my penthouse with the late afternoon light cutting long shadows across the floor, holding a phone that had just delivered 2 separate pieces of information that changed the shape of everything I thought I was facing. Julian hadn't just stolen the company. He had walked straight into a cage that someone else had built for him. And the woman who had helped spread the video that destroyed my reputation was now asking to meet me in person and suggesting she had been working towards something I didn't yet understand. I set the phone down on the windowsill and looked out at Chicago. Somewhere in this city, multiple people were making moves on a board I was only beginning to read. I needed to understand every piece before I touched a single one. She was already there when I arrived. I had expected to walk in first. It was 6:55, and I had been early on purpose, the way I always am when I don't know what I'm walking into. But Sloane Mercer was sitting at the corner table with her back to the wall, a cup of coffee in front of her that had clearly been there long enough to stop steaming. She had arrived before me by a significant margin. That told me something. I recognized her from company events, late 30s. Dark hair pulled back, the kind of composed stillness that most people mistake for coldness. She watched me cross the room without any change in expression, and when I sat down across from her, she didn't extend a hand or offer a greeting. She just looked at me the way someone looks at a person, they have been trying to figure out for a long time. "You're S," I said. "I'm Sloane Mercer," she said. "I've been your son's director of communications for 2 years. I'm the one who distributed the video on Saturday morning." I appreciated that she said it directly. I told her so. "I don't have time for anything else," she said. "And neither do you." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup and began to talk. Her father's name was Richard Mercer. 20 years ago, Richard Mercer had been a commercial real estate developer in Detroit, not a large operation, but a solid one, the kind of business a man builds slowly over a decade with more integrity than capital. In 2009, he entered into a joint venture with Vincenzo Rossi on a mixed-use development project in the Midtown Detroit corridor. The deal was structured so that Rossi's holding company controlled the financing, while Richard's firm managed construction and leasing. 18 months in Rossi began inflating the project's reported liabilities through a series of intercompany loans between his own entities, a technique sometimes called liability stuffing, where a developer artificially increases the debt load on a shared project to crowd out a partner's equity position. By the time Richard Mercer's attorneys identified what was happening, his ownership stake had been diluted to the point where he had no practical recourse. The project went forward. Rossi took the returns. Richard Mercer's firm was left holding residual obligations it couldn't service. Richard Mercer died by suicide in 2011. Sloane was 18 years old. She told me all of this without her voice breaking. Not because she had no feeling about it, I could see exactly how much feeling was behind every word. But because she had told this story to herself so many times over so many years that the emotional architecture of it had been reinforced into something that held. I spent 4 years in finance and 2 more in communications specifically so that I could get close enough to Rossi's world to understand how he operates, she said. Julian was the door. When he started positioning himself against you 2 years ago, he needed a communications director who could handle a complex public narrative. I made sure he found me. "You've been inside the company for 2 years," I said slowly. "Waiting. Watching," she corrected. "Waiting implies I had a plan. For most of that time, I just wanted to understand the full picture before I decided what to do with it." And now, she reached into the bag beside her chair and placed a USB drive on the table between us. Small, black, unremarkable. "That contains email correspondence between Julian and Rossi going back 14 months, she said. "Operational planning for the fire, insurance fraud discussions, timeline coordination. It's enough to establish premeditation on both counts." I looked at the drive, but didn't pick it up yet. "Why didn't you take this to the FBI directly?" "Because email evidence from a corporate server obtained by an employee who is also a potential witness gets complicated in federal court. Defense attorneys spend 6 months arguing admissibility while the actual evidence sits in a filing cabinet." She paused. "You need something visual, something that shows a jury exactly what happened and doesn't require a forensic accountant to explain." I thought about Leo. About a 10-year-old boy with a brand new drone pointing it at a building full of party lights on a clear October night, completely unaware of what he was recording 40 feet above his father's head. "I may have that," I said carefully, "but I need to confirm it first." Something shifted in Sloane's expression, not surprise, exactly more like the recognition of a variable she hadn't fully calculated. "The drone," she said. "I didn't confirm or deny it. You said you wanted to understand the full picture before deciding what to do. What did you decide?" She looked at me for a long moment. "I decided that watching 2 men destroy each other from the inside wasn't the same as justice, and that what happened to my father deserves something more specific than collateral damage." I picked up the USB drive and put it in my jacket pocket. "There are things I need to verify before we go any further," I told her. "If what you've given me holds up, I'll be in touch." I stood to leave, then stopped. "Your father, the way Rossi pushed him out, I've seen that structure used before. He was not a careless man. He was maneuvered. Sloane looked up at me. For the first time since I'd sat down, something in her face moved in a way she hadn't controlled. I know, she said quietly. I left her there with her cold coffee and walked back out into the October morning. The drive was in my pocket. The drone was across town in a 10-year-old boy's bedroom. And the next move was the one I had been turning over since the moment I'd seen Julian's face through the smoke on Friday night. I got in my car and drove toward Lincoln Park. Julian's house was a 4-story brownstone on a quiet street 2 blocks from the park. The kind of address that communicated success without shouting it, which had always been more my style than my son's. He had bought it 3 years ago, and every time I visited, I noticed small renovations that suggested someone was spending money faster than they were making it. New kitchen, new windows, a security system that had been upgraded twice in 18 months. The guard at the front door was a man I didn't recognize. Julian had changed his household security staff sometime in the past year, another detail I had noted and filed away. He looked at me with the particular blank authority of someone who had been given a list of names to admit and was deciding whether mine was on it. "I'm here to see Leo," I said. "I'm his grandfather." There was a pause while he checked something on a tablet. Whatever instruction Julian had given about managing my access hadn't extended to blocking me from my own grandson. The door opened. The housekeeper, a woman named Donna, who had worked for Julian since Leo was born, met me in the entryway. She was visibly relieved to see me, the kind of relief that told me the house had been tense since Friday night, in ways that a 10-year-old didn't fully understand, but could absolutely feel. "He's upstairs," she said. "He's been asking about you." I found Leo in his room sitting cross-legged on his bed with a laptop open in front of him, watching a video about drone photography techniques, with the focused attention that children reserve for the things they genuinely love. He looked up when I knocked, and for a moment, his face did something complicated. Relief and worry arriving at exactly the same time, the way they do when you're 10 years old, and something has been frightening, and you're not sure whether the adult who just walked in is going to make it better or explain why it's worse. "Grandpa." He closed the laptop and moved to make room beside him on the bed. I sat down. We talked about nothing important for a few minutes, his week at school, a project he was working on about the history of Chicago architecture, a fact he had learned about the construction of the Tribune Tower that he wanted to make sure I already knew. I let him talk. I needed him to be comfortable before I asked him anything. Then he said it himself. "I was flying it that night, at your party." He glanced at the drone sitting on his desk, a DJI Mini 4 Pro, charcoal gray propeller guards still attached from the last flight. I had chosen it myself for his birthday 3 months ago, specifically because of its quiet propeller system and low-light camera capability. At the time, those had simply been the features that made it the best option for a child who wanted to film things without disturbing anyone. Now those same features felt like something else entirely. "I wanted to film the lights from above," Leo continued. "The building looked amazing. I switched it to quiet mode like you showed me because I didn't want it to be annoying during the party." He hesitated. "And then the smoke started and I got scared and brought it down right away." "That was the right thing to do," I said. "Were you filming the whole time it was up?" He nodded. "The camera was running. It auto-records whenever the motors are on." "Did you see anything interesting before the smoke started?" He thought about it with the genuine seriousness of a child who wants to give an accurate answer. "I saw the roof gardens on the building next door, and some cars on the street, and—" He paused. "I saw Dad." I kept my voice completely even. "Where was he?" "By the side door, the one with the green light above it. He was on his phone and there were 2 men near him. I thought he was just taking a call because of the party." Leo looked at me carefully. "Is that important?" "It might be," I said. "Can I see the footage? He retrieved the memory card from the drone's battery compartment and slotted it into his laptop. The footage loaded 43 minutes of aerial recording, beginning at 8:47 p.m. shot in the drone's enhanced low-light mode. The camera system compensated automatically for darkness, producing footage that was clear and steady. At the 22-minute mark, the angle swept across the eastern face of the building. The emergency access panel was visible, lit by the mandatory low-level lighting that building code required at all exit points. Julian was standing at the panel. His face was fully illuminated. His right hand held a device I recognized as a building management remote, the kind used to access mechanical and security override functions. Two men in dark work clothes stood several feet behind him. Julian looked directly at the remote in his hand. He pressed something. Above the door, the indicator light shifted from green to red. Then he nodded to the two men. I watched it twice. The second time I watched Leo watching me watch it. His expression was careful and uncertain, the way a child looks when they understand that an adult is reacting to something significant, and they're not sure if they're supposed to ask about it. I did not touch the file. I only watched enough to know what it showed. Then I closed the laptop and called Inspector Croft. If that footage was going to survive in court, it needed to be copied properly from the original card with a clean chain of custody. A process that took less than 90 seconds. Then I ejected the memory card and handed it back to him. "Does the card go back in the same slot?" I asked, as though I was asking for his help rather than making sure everything was returned exactly as I had found it. "Yeah, here." He snapped it back into place. I did not take the original. If the memory card disappeared, Julian's people would know immediately that someone had found it. Left in place, it was simply a child's home video of a birthday party. Leo looked at me. "Grandpa, is Dad in trouble?" I put my hand on his shoulder. "Your dad made some choices that grown-ups have to be accountable for. But none of this is because of anything he did. Do you understand that?" He nodded slowly. "Then because he was 10 and fundamentally still himself. Can I show you the Tribune Tower thing? Now it's actually really interesting. Really. I told him I would love that. And I meant it. I sat with my grandson for another hour. When I finally stood to leave, I had 43 minutes of footage on my phone, a USB drive full of emails in my jacket pocket, and the clearest picture yet of exactly how far Julian had been willing to go. What I still needed was someone with the authority to do something about it. And I was starting to think I knew exactly who that was. The building smelled like old coffee and older paperwork. I had walked past the Chicago Fire Department headquarters on West Washington Street 100 times over 40 years without ever needing to go inside. This morning, I pushed through the glass door with a USB drive in my breast pocket and drone footage saved to my phone, and I told myself that what I was doing was not desperation. It was architecture. You gather your materials before you build. The desk sergeant directed me to the third floor without asking my name. Inspector Elias Croft was already in his office when I arrived, standing at a whiteboard covered in photographs and red string. He was in his early 50s, a fire marshal, with 22 years in the department, and he had the kind of face that had seen too many burned buildings and believed too few explanations. He did not smile when I knocked on the open door. "Mr. Sterling," he said, "I was wondering when you'd show up." I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. "You were expecting me." "I was expecting someone." He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "The fire at the Glass Cathedral is the most complicated arson case I have worked in over 2 decades. Buildings like that do not burn the way yours did without sophisticated help." I sat down and placed the USB drive on his desk. He looked at it but did not touch it. "Before I open that," he said, "I need to understand who you are in this investigation. Victim witness or something else." "I am the owner of record," I said. "And I installed a private camera system on the 4th and 7th floors 14 months ago. Air-gapped, encrypted, not connected to any network. That got his attention. He pulled his chair out slowly and sat down. Air-gapped means no remote access. No one could wipe it remotely. Correct. The footage is stored on a physical drive inside a locked maintenance panel. The panel has a separate combination that only I know. He studied me. Why did you install it? I chose my words carefully. I had reasons to believe someone with access to that building might eventually use it against me. I wanted a record that could not be erased. And the footage, have you retrieved it? Not yet. I need your office to accompany me, which means I need to sign an authorization form designating you as a permitted party to access the system under my ownership rights. I had spoken to a property attorney the night before. Under Illinois law, a private property owner could grant a law enforcement officer access to a non-networked surveillance system without a warrant, provided the owner signed a written consent document. My attorney drafted the language last night. It is ready. Elias picked up the USB drive and plugged it into a standalone reader connected to a laptop that was not his main workstation. Smart man. He scrolled for 30 seconds and stopped. His jaw tightened. This email, he said, turning the screen toward me. 6 months ago. It references a remote override of the emergency panel. Walk me through what that means technically. The Glass Cathedral has a dual-layer fire suppression system, I said. The emergency panel controls both the suppression release and the external door locks. Someone with the override code could disable suppression and seal the exits simultaneously. And this name. He pointed at the screen. Derek Cole. He was listed as a maintenance contractor on the building's permit records. We flagged his access credentials 2 days ago. The ignition device we recovered from Sublevel 2 was activated using his digital login. Derek Cole worked for Sterling Architecture Group for 3 years, I said. He was dismissed 14 months ago. Someone reactivated his credentials after termination. Elias leaned back. Reactivating a terminated credential is not a mistake. It is a deliberate act designed to create a false trail. He looked at me steadily. Mr. Sterling, I need you to give me everything. The authorization form, the physical drive location, the name of whoever gave you this USB. Everything. I thought about Sloane, about the 8 years she had spent inside Rossi's world, waiting for this exact moment. I will give you what you need to build the case, I said. But I need 3 weeks before any arrest is made. If Julian or Rossi suspect the investigation has turned, they will move assets and destroy what is left. Elias was quiet for a long time. Outside his window, a fire truck rolled out of the bay below lights already spinning. 3 weeks, he said finally. But if another life is at risk, that window closes without notice. I nodded and stood. He walked me to the door himself, which told me more than his words had. I was halfway down the corridor when my phone buzzed. A message from Marcus Webb, 4 words that landed like a fist against glass. They changed the demolition schedule. I stopped walking. The physical drive was still inside the Glass Cathedral, and according to the message, the building would come down on Friday. Marcus kept his office on the 14th floor overlooking the Chicago River, and he had always said the view reminded him that everything in this city moved whether you wanted it to or not. When I arrived that afternoon, he was standing at the window with his back to me, and his phone pressed flat against his thigh, and I could tell from the set of his shoulders that he had already seen the demolition order. They moved it up 3 weeks, he said without turning around. The permits were filed 4 days ago. I crossed the room and stood beside him. Below us, the river caught the afternoon light and threw it back in pieces. I know, I said. I am going to the building tomorrow morning with Inspector Croft. We retrieve the drive before the crew goes in. He turned. Marcus Webb was 64 years old, a financial strategist who had worked alongside me since the firm's 3rd year. He was not an architect and had never pretended to be one. What he understood was pressure, the kind that either revealed a structure's integrity or exposed every hidden flaw. Right now, his face was doing both. "Arthur," he said quietly, "if Julian filed that demolition order 4 days ago, that is the same day he signed the buyout agreement with you." I had not said that out loud yet. Hearing it from Marcus made something settle cold in my chest. "He knew about the camera," Marcus said. "Or he suspected. Either way, he moved to bury the evidence before you could reach it, which means someone told him." I walked to his desk and sat down. "That is why I came today, Marcus. Not just for the drive. I need you out of Chicago for the next 2 weeks." He frowned. "You are asking me to run. I am asking you to survive." I held his gaze. "Rossi's pattern is not violence. It is isolation. He removes every person standing near his target until the target is completely alone. You are the most visible ally I have left. Your name is on every significant financial document connected to this firm." Marcus was quiet. He moved away from the window and sat across from me. "What exactly does Julian think he took from you?" "Everything visible," I said. "The share buyout, the firm's operational accounts, the real estate held under the Sterling Architecture Group name. He believes he controls the entirety of what this firm was worth. But he does not. 11 years ago, I moved the majority of my personal assets into 2 separate structures," I said. "The first is a Delaware LLC with a single member which holds the intellectual property rights to every design I created before the firm was incorporated. Those rights were never transferred to the company. They remained mine personally, untouched by the buyout." Marcus nodded. He had helped me structure that arrangement and had never once mentioned it to anyone inside the firm. "The second is an irrevocable trust established in 2019, I continued. "Real estate assets and a private investment portfolio transferred into it before any dispute arose. Once assets move into an irrevocable trust, they are no longer mine in the legal sense. They belong to the trust. No judgment against me personally, and no forced sale connected to the firm can reach them." "Julian celebrated taking everything," Marcus said slowly. "And he took a fraction." "Yes. But none of it matters if that drive is rubble by Saturday morning." I leaned forward. "And none of it matters if Rossi decides you are a problem before we are ready to move." I laid out what Sloane had told me about Rossi's history. Not everything, not yet. Just enough. By the time I finished, Marcus was already reaching for his phone to call his wife. He did not argue further about leaving. That more than anything told me how clearly he understood the danger. I rode the elevator down alone. The lobby was quiet, the kind of afternoon quiet that feels borrowed rather than earned. I turned over the one detail that would not settle. The demolition order had been filed 4 days ago. The same day, Julian signed the buyout. He had moved against the evidence before I ever walked into Elias Croft's office, which meant he was not reacting to me. He was already 3 steps ahead, and somewhere in that calculation was a name I did not yet have. Before I tell you what was inside that building, and trust me, what that camera recorded will change everything you thought you knew about this story, type "I'm still here" in the comments right now. I need to know you are with me for this part. A heads up, parts of this story include fictional elements built for entertainment and reflection. If that is not something you want to continue with, this is a good place to step away, no judgment at all. For everyone staying, let's keep going. The crane was already parked on the east side of the block when Elias Croft and I turned onto the street at 6:45 in the morning. It sat there in the gray October light like something patient and indifferent, a machine that did not care what a building had meant to the people who built it, or how many years had gone into every beam and pane and calculated angle. It was simply waiting to do what it had been brought here to do. I had not been back to the Glass Cathedral since the night it burned. I had told myself that was a practical decision. There was nothing useful I could do at a sealed crime scene. But standing on the sidewalk, now looking up at the scorched facade, and the blackened window frames, I understood that I had also been afraid. Not of the building, of what it would feel like to see it like this, stripped of everything that had made it worth building in the first place. I stood there for a moment longer than I needed to. The morning air was cold and carried the faint smell of ash that rain had not entirely washed away. Elias said nothing beside me, which I appreciated. He was a man who understood that some silences needed to be walked through rather than filled. I understood for the first time standing there that grief and anger could occupy exactly the same space inside a person without either one canceling the other out. They did not take turns. They did not negotiate. They simply stood together the way two load-bearing walls can share the same corner without either one giving way. I looked at the building for one more second. Then I looked at Elias. "Let's go in," I said. "Structural report says the 4th floor is accessible," Elias said beside me. He was carrying an evidence kit and had 2 officers from his unit standing 10 feet back. Fire damage concentrated in sub-level 2 and floors 1 through 3. 4 and above sustained smoke and water damage, but the load-bearing elements held. He looked at me. "You designed it that way deliberately." "I designed every building to outlast the worst thing I could imagine happening to it," I said. "I just did not imagine the worst thing would come from inside my own family." We went in through the service entrance on the north side, which Elias had arranged to have unsealed the previous evening. The smell hit me the moment I stepped through the door, wet ash and melted plastic, and something underneath it that I could not name, something that smelled like the absence of everything the building had been. I kept moving. You do not stop in the middle of a structure you are trying to save. The stairwell to the 4th floor was intact. The walls were stained dark with smoke residue, and the carpet on the landing had been reduced to a blackened crust, but the concrete beneath it was solid. I tested each step before I put my weight on it. Elias followed without comment. His 2 officers stayed at the base of the stairs. The maintenance corridor on the 4th floor ran along the building's north wall, behind a series of utility doors that most visitors had never known existed. I had designed it as a service spine, a quiet passage for building systems that needed to be accessible without disrupting the spaces on either side. The 3rd door on the left had a standard lock on the outside and a combination mechanism on the inside panel. I had never written the combination down anywhere. I worked the numbers. The panel opened. The Pelican case was exactly where I had left it 14 months ago, bolted to the lower shelf, latched shut, the foam interior, keeping the drive sealed against moisture and impact. I handed it to Elias without opening it. He set it on the floor, snapped on gloves, and began the chain of custody documentation, writing the date, time, location, and both our names on an evidence label before he touched the latch. That was the procedure. Without it, the drive would be inadmissible. "Someone tried to get in here before us," he said quietly, tilting a flashlight toward the edge of the panel door. I leaned in and looked. There were fresh scratch marks around the combination mechanism, the kind left by someone who had tried a pick and failed. "When?" I said. "Recent. The scoring is bright, no oxidation." He looked at me. "Within the last 4 days. 4 days. The same window as the demolition order. Someone had known the drive existed and had tried to reach it first. They had failed because the combination was in my head and nowhere else, but they had tried." That single fact changed the shape of everything. Julian had not simply moved to demolish the evidence by scheduling the crane. He had also sent someone in person, which meant he understood exactly what was stored in that panel. "Brennan Holt," Elias said, reading from his phone as we walked back toward the stairwell. "The demolition crew chief. His team is cleared to enter at 8. We have just under an hour." I looked back once at the maintenance corridor before we descended. The building was going to come down in a matter of days regardless of what we found on that drive. 40 years of work reduced to rubble and a salvage auction. I had spent the walk up thinking about what I was trying to save. Walking down, I understood it more precisely. Not the building, the truth that was inside it. We emerged onto the street at 7:22. Brennan Holt was already there, a broad-shouldered man in a hard hat and a company jacket standing beside the crane with a clipboard and a look of mild irritation. He glanced at Elias's department badge and relaxed slightly. "Inspector," he said, "we are scheduled for 8. You will have your access at 8, Elias said. "We are finished here." Holt looked at the Pelican case in Elias's hand and then looked away the way people do when they have been told not to ask questions. I watched him carefully. He was either incurious by nature or very well practiced at appearing so. In the car with the case secured in Elias's evidence bag in the back seat, he turned to me before he started the engine. "Arthur," he said. It was the first time he had used my first name. "Whatever is on this drive, are you prepared for it to be worse than you expect?" I had been asking myself that question since the night the building burned. I still did not have a clean answer. "Drive," I said. Elias had a viewing room on the second floor of the department building, a narrow space with a metal table, 2 monitors, and the particular silence of a room where people came to look at things they could not unsee. He had cleared it for the morning. When we sat down and he connected the drive, I noticed his hands were steady, in a way that mine were not. The footage was organized by date, each file time-stamped and indexed. Elias moved directly to October 3rd without asking which date I wanted. He already knew. I watched him navigate the directory with the efficiency of someone who had done this hundreds of times, and I understood that for him, this was evidence. For me, it was something else entirely. It was the last night my life had the shape I had spent 40 years building. The camera on the 4th floor covered the main service corridor and a partial view of the emergency panel alcove 1 level below through a recessed angle I had built into the system specifically for that sightline. When I had designed the placement, I had told myself I was being thorough. Sitting in that viewing room, I understood I had been afraid of exactly this moment, afraid enough to prepare for it, but not enough to fully believe it would come. The timestamp read 8:47 p.m. Julian appeared first. He was wearing a dark jacket and carrying nothing in his hands, which struck me immediately as deliberate, the posture of a man who had made sure he was not holding anything that could be described in a witness statement. He moved to the panel with the ease of someone who had rehearsed the approach. He did not look up. He did not know the camera was there. "He knows the override code," Elias said. "I gave it to him 4 years ago," I said, "when he was running the firm's operations division, standard protocol for senior management." I watched my son open the emergency panel and key in a sequence. On screen, a small indicator light shifted from green to red. Fire suppression disabled. Door locks engaged. The whole sequence took 11 seconds. Elias paused the footage. 11 seconds. He had done that before. I did not answer. There was nothing to say that would not break something I was not ready to break yet. He resumed the recording. At 8:51 p.m., Derek Cole appeared from the sub-level access door at the far end of the corridor. Cole was a compact man in his mid-40s, with a workman's walk, someone who moved like he was accustomed to being invisible inside buildings. He was carrying a canvas bag and did not look at Julian directly. They had agreed in advance that the less visible their connection appeared on any recording, the better. Cole set the bag down, opened it, and removed a device. Elias leaned forward. "Remote detonator assembly," he said. "Consistent with what we recovered from sub-level 2. "Can you match it to what forensics found?" I asked. They already matched a partial serial number from the recovered fragments. "This confirms it is the same unit." He made a note without looking away from the screen. Cole's digital login activated the building access system at 8:49 p.m., 2 minutes after Julian disabled suppression. The sequence was coordinated to the minute. Cole worked without pausing. At 8:57 p.m., he picked up the empty bag and walked back through the sub-level door. Julian remained at the panel for another 40 seconds, motionless, as though he was listening to something I could not hear. Then he turned toward the main corridor, and a third figure stepped into the frame. I had not been expecting a third person. The figure came from the east stairwell, moving with a quick, deliberate stride. Dark clothing, a cap pulled low, the face angled away from the camera, with the practiced awareness of someone who understood where lenses were placed in rooms. What the camera caught was a partial profile, a jawline, a height, a particular way of holding the shoulders that pulled at something deep in my memory without resolving into a name. The figure crossed to Julian. They spoke. The camera was visual, only no audio, but the exchange lasted under 90 seconds. Julian nodded twice. The figure passed him something small that disappeared into Julian's jacket pocket. Then the figure turned and walked back toward the east stairwell without looking back. "Do you know that person?" Elias asked. I stared at the frozen frame on the monitor. The jawline. The shoulders. The way the figure had moved through that corridor, as though they belonged there, as though they had walked it before. "Not yet," I said. Elias saved the footage to a secure departmental server and began drafting the formal evidence report. I remained in my chair and looked at the ceiling of that narrow room and tried to place the figure. I had encountered that posture somewhere in the past 2 weeks. Someone who had been physically close to me. Someone who had positioned themselves near me during all of this. The thought arrived quietly, the way the most dangerous thoughts always do not, as a shock, but as a slow recognition of something that had been present the entire time, waiting for me to look at it directly. I was not going to say it aloud. Not yet. Not until I was certain. Because if I was right, it changed not just the investigation, but every conversation I had trusted since the night the building burned. I stood up when Elias finished his report. He walked me to the door of the viewing room and stopped with his hand on the frame. "Arthur," he said, "whoever that third person is, when you figure it out, you call me first. Not Sloane, not Marcus. Me." I looked at him. He held my gaze without explanation, which was its own kind of answer. I walked out into this corridor alone and did not look back at the monitor still glowing behind the closing door. The drive was secured. The footage was real. Julian was on camera committing a federal crime in 11 seconds. But somewhere in my corner, someone had been in that building the same night, and I had been thanking them ever since. I did not go home after I left the fire department. I walked instead, which was something I had not done without a destination in years. Chicago in October has a particular quality in the late morning. The light comes in low and sideways, hitting the buildings at angles that reveal every seam and repair every place where something has been patched over rather than fixed. I had spent 40 years designing structures that would not need patching. Walking through the city, now I felt the irony of that with unusual sharpness. The third figure in the footage had not left my mind for a single minute since I walked out of that viewing room. Elias's warning had followed me out the door like a second shadow. Not Sloane. Not Marcus. Me. He had said it without explanation, which meant he had a reason he was not yet prepared to share. That was either professional caution or something more specific. I needed to know which. I stopped at a coffee shop on Michigan Avenue, took a corner table with my back to the wall, and opened my notebook. Old habit. When a structural problem resisted analysis, I had always found it useful to draw the constraints first, not the solution, but the boundaries within which any solution had to exist. The figure in that corridor had satisfied 3 conditions simultaneously. First, they knew the building's layout well enough to approach from the east stairwell and exit the same way, avoiding the main corridors. The east stairwell was not marked on any public floor plan. It appeared only in the original construction documents and the building's permit filings. Second, they had positioned their face away from the camera at every moment, not randomly, but with precision. They knew the camera existed, or at minimum, they knew that a building like the Glass Cathedral would have coverage in its service corridors. Third, they had something to give Julian that fit in a jacket pocket and was worth a 90-second conversation on the night of a coordinated arson. I wrote the 3 conditions down and then wrote a single question underneath them. Who in my life over the past 2 weeks had been close enough to learn all 3 things from me without my realizing I was teaching them? The answer that formed was not comfortable. I pulled out my phone and called Nora Caldwell, a real estate attorney I had worked with on 3 building acquisitions over the past decade. Nora was 47, methodical, and had no connection to Julian or Rossi beyond the routine legal work she had done for the firm. What she did have was access to the permit archive for the Glass Cathedral, which she had helped file 6 years ago. "Arthur," she said when she picked up, "I heard about the fire. I am sorry. I need the complete access authorization list from the original permit filing," I said. "Everyone who was designated as having building access rights at the time of construction. Not the operational list, the permit list." A pause. "That is public record. I can pull it in an hour. I need it in 20 minutes. Another pause, shorter this time. "Give me the filing number." I gave it to her from memory and hung up. While I waited, I went back to the notebook and began writing names. Not suspects, that was too formal a word for what I was doing. I was writing a list of people who had been physically near me since October 3rd, cross-referenced against the 3 conditions. Most names fell away immediately. They did not know the building. They did not know about the camera. They had no connection to Julian's interests. 2 names remained when I finished the exercise. One of them I dismissed almost immediately. The logic did not hold under pressure. The motive was thin, the access was indirect, and the timeline did not fit the 4 days between the demolition order and the scratch marks on the maintenance panel. The other name I sat with for a long time. Nora sent the permit access list as a PDF. I opened it and scanned the designated parties. Building owner construction, supervisor fire systems contractor, 2 named architects from the firm, and a consulting structural engineer listed as a secondary access holder for the duration of the fit-out phase. The name attached to that designation had not been on my mental list because I had never associated that person with the building's technical systems. But there it was. I closed the PDF and looked out the window at the street. People moved past in the ordinary rhythm of a Wednesday morning, carrying coffee and bags and the accumulated weight of their own private complications, none of which intersected with mine. I thought about all the conversations I had trusted since the fire, all the information I had shared, all the moments I had believed I was being helped when I might instead have been being observed. I paid for my coffee and left. I had one more thing to check before I could be certain. I needed to see the east stairwell access log from the night of October 3rd, specifically whether the figure had used a key card or entered through an unlocked door. If it was a key card, Elias would have the record. If it was an unlocked door, someone had arranged it in advance. I called Elias from the street. He picked up on the second ring. "The east stairwell on October 3rd, I said. "Was that door on the access log system?" A beat of silence. "It was," he said. "It showed an entry at 8:44 p.m. using a contractor access card that was issued during the original construction phase and never deactivated." "Whose card?" He told me. And the last piece settled into place with the quiet, terrible precision of a load-bearing wall finding its footing. I found her at the same Wicker Park Cafe where we had met 4 days earlier. She was already there when I arrived, sitting in the same chair she had chosen that first morning, with her hands around a ceramic mug and her eyes on the door. She saw me the moment I stepped inside. Her expression did not change, which was itself a kind of answer. Sloane Mercer was 41 years old. I had known her as Richard Mercer's daughter before I knew her as a communications director, and I had trusted her with information that I had shared with almost no one else since the fire. She had given me the USB drive. She had guided me toward the drone footage. She had positioned herself from the very first conversation as the person who understood, more than anyone else, what Julian and Rossi were capable of. All of that was still true. What I had not considered carefully enough was that understanding something deeply and being neutral about it were not the same condition. I sat down across from her and ordered coffee from the server without looking at the menu. Sloane watched me settle into the chair with the patience of someone who had learned to read the meaning behind small physical details. "You look like you found something," she said. "I found several things," I said. "The drive is secured. Elias has the footage. Julian is on camera at the emergency panel for 11 seconds at 8:47 p.m. She nodded slowly. "That is enough for an arrest." "It will be," I said, "along with Derek Cole on camera placing the detonator assembly, and the email chain you gave me confirming premeditated planning." I paused. "And the third person in the east stairwell at 8:44 p.m. using a contractor access card from the original construction phase." Something moved behind her eyes. It was brief, a fraction of a second, but I had spent 40 years watching structures respond to stress, and I knew what a microfracture looked like. "A third person," she said. "The card was issued during the fit-out phase," I said. "It was never deactivated. The person who used it knew the east stairwell approach, knew the corridor layout, and knew precisely where not to look on the way through." Sloane set her mug down carefully. "Arthur, what are you asking me?" "I am not asking anything yet," I said. "I am telling you what I know, because I think you deserve to hear it from me directly rather than from Elias Croft in a formal interview room." The cafe was filling up around us, the noise of other people's mornings, creating a kind of privacy in the crowd. Sloane looked at her hands for a long moment. When she looked up, something in her face had shifted. Not guilt exactly, but the particular expression of someone who has been carrying a weight they had not expected anyone else to find. "My father lost everything because of Rossi," she said quietly. "You know that." "I know that. What I have never told you is that before he died, he made me promise something." She held my gaze. "He told me that destroying Rossi from the outside would never work. That the only way to end it was from inside, using Rossi's own methods against him." "And Julian," I said. "Julian trusted me because I made him believe I was useful to him," she said. "I have been inside that operation for 8 years. I know things about Rossi that are not on any USB drive." She paused. "On October 3rd, I was there to make sure something happened that needed to happen, and to make sure something else did not." I looked at her steadily. "What did you prevent?" She held the pause for a long moment, long enough that I understood she was deciding how much to give me. "There was a second device," she said finally, "in the main atrium. Cole placed the first one in sub-level 2 to start the fire. The second was meant to bring down the central support column during evacuation." She met my eyes without flinching. "I removed it before anyone entered the building. The coffee in my cup had gone cold. I had not touched it." "You saved lives," I said. "I did what my father would have done if he had understood in time that waiting was not the same as losing." She looked at me with something I could only describe as exhausted honesty. "The question is whether you trust me enough to let me finish what I came here to do." I looked at her across that small table in the morning noise of that cafe, and thought about all the structures I had built that had held under pressure they were never supposed to face. Then I thought about the ones that had not. "Tell me what you need," I said. But even as I said it, I was already wondering what else she had decided not to tell me yet. Sloane had arranged the meeting through a channel I would not have thought to use, a mutual contact in the city's Architectural Preservation Committee who had served on Senator Harold Briggs's staff 8 years earlier. It was the kind of connection that only existed because Sloane had spent 8 years building a web of relationships that looked from the outside like ordinary professional networking. From the inside, I was beginning to understand it was something more deliberate than that. Senator Harold Briggs was 64 years old, a 2-term Illinois senator with a reputation for methodical caution and an absolute intolerance for being made to look foolish. He had been at the Glass Cathedral on the night of October 3rd because his office had purchased a table at what he had understood to be a private architectural gala. He had been in the East Corridor when the fire started and had sustained burns to his left forearm that required 2 nights of hospital observation. When we arrived at his Chicago field office on the afternoon of October 10th, he was seated behind his desk with his left arm resting on the surface, the bandaging still visible beneath his rolled sleeve, and his expression was the expression of a man who had decided that whatever had happened to him was not going to remain unaddressed. "Mr. Sterling," he said when I sat down. He did not extend the bandaged arm. "I was told you have material relevant to the fire investigation. I have footage from a private camera system inside the building," I said, "along with a 14-month email chain documenting premeditated arson and a $33 million fraudulent insurance claim. Inspector Elias Croft of the Chicago Fire Department is the primary investigator. The evidence is currently in his custody." Briggs looked at Sloane, who was seated to my left. "And you are Sloane Mercer," she said. "I was communications director for Rossi Capital Partners for 6 years. The email chain came from materials I collected in the course of that role." "Rossi Capital." Briggs said the name the way a careful man handles something he suspects is sharp. "Vincenzo Rossi." "Yes," I said. He was quiet for a moment. His assistant, a young woman who had not introduced herself, sat in the corner taking notes without being asked. "What is it you need from me?" Briggs said. "The arson, the electronic communications, and the $33 million insurance claim create federal exposure," I said. "This is no longer just a local fire investigation. Your injury as a sitting senator introduces an additional federal dimension that local investigation cannot fully address. We need the FBI engaged before Rossi's legal team has time to build a containment strategy." Briggs looked at his bandaged arm. Then he looked at me. "You are asking me to request a private federal briefing. I am asking you to look at the footage first," I said. "After that, the decision is yours." He nodded once and asked his assistant to set up the secure tablet. We spent 40 minutes in that office. Briggs watched the camera footage without speaking. He read 6 of the most critical emails from the USB chain. When he looked up, something in his face had settled into a particular kind of stillness that I recognized as controlled anger in a man who had learned to govern his reactions. "I will make 2 calls this afternoon," he said. "One to the FBI field office, one to the Judiciary Committee chair." He paused. "Mr. Sterling, I want you to understand that once this moves to federal level, the timeline and the strategy are no longer entirely yours to control." "I understand," I said. We stood to leave. At the door, Sloane stopped and turned back. "Senator," she said, "you should know that Rossi has done this before. The Sterling situation is not the first. There were at least 2 other families, one in Milwaukee in 2019, one in Indianapolis in 2021. Both involved debt acquisition, asset stripping, and at least 1 insurance claim. Neither case was prosecuted." Briggs said nothing for a moment. "Then do you have documentation on those cases?" "I have enough to point the right investigators in the right direction," Sloane said. We left him sitting at his desk with the tablet still open in front of him. In the corridor outside his office, I waited until we were through the first set of doors before I spoke. "The Milwaukee and Indianapolis cases," I said. "You knew about those before you came to me." "Yes," she said. "How long have you known?" She looked straight ahead as we walked. "Since 2020, she said. "I found the Milwaukee file in Rossi's private server during a routine communications audit. I kept a copy." I stopped walking. "Sloane, what else is on that server?" She kept moving for 2 more steps before she stopped and turned to face me. The corridor was empty. The fluorescent light above us hummed with the particular frequency of institutional buildings everywhere. "Enough to end it," she said. "All of it. Not just Julian, Not just the fire. Everything Rossi has built over 15 years. I looked at her and thought about what Arthur Sterling, the man I had been before October 3rd, would have said to that. Then I thought about what the man I was becoming needed to say instead. "Show me," I said. Rossi's Chicago office occupied the top 2 floors of a glass tower on North Wacker Drive, the kind of address that announced a certain type of ambition without apology. I had designed 3 buildings within visible distance of it over the course of my career. Standing in the lobby that morning, waiting for the elevator, I looked out through the glass facade at the skyline I knew better than almost anyone alive, and I reminded myself that the man waiting upstairs believed he had already won. That belief was his most significant vulnerability. Vincenzo Rossi was 63 years old and looked it in the way that powerful men sometimes do, not diminished by age but concentrated by it, as though the decades had compressed him into something denser and more difficult to move. He was seated at the far end of a conference table when I was shown in with his hands flat on the surface and his cufflinks catching the morning light. Beside him sat Dominic Reeves, his senior legal counsel, 55 years old, gray-suited, with the careful stillness of a man whose job was to observe everything and react to nothing. "Arthur," Rossi said. He did not stand. "Thank you for coming." "You made it difficult to decline," I said. I sat down at the opposite end of the table without being invited to. Reeves made a small note on the legal pad in front of him. "I want to resolve this cleanly," Rossi said. "I have always preferred clean resolutions. They are better for everyone involved." "What resolution are you proposing?" I said. He leaned back slightly. "You are 70 years old. You have lost the firm, the building, and the majority of your professional standing. Continued litigation, and I assure you there will be litigation in multiple jurisdictions for years, will consume whatever remains of your time and your resources." He paused. "I am prepared to offer you a structured settlement. $8 million transferred to an account of your choosing in exchange for a full release of any claims against Rossi Capital Partners, Julian Sterling, or any affiliated entity." "And the fire investigation," I said. "Inspector Croft's investigation will proceed to whatever conclusion the evidence supports," Rossi said smoothly. "I have no ability to interfere with that, and I would not attempt to. But you are asking me to stop cooperating with it." Reeves spoke for the first time. "We are asking you to consider whether your continued involvement serves your personal interests, Mr. Sterling. You are a witness, not a complainant. Your cooperation is voluntary." I looked at Reeves with the attention I gave to structural calculations, methodically, without hurry. He was choosing his words with the precision of a man who understood that everything said in this room could eventually be repeated in front of a judge. He was not threatening me. He was constructing a sentence that would survive scrutiny while delivering a message that would not. "I appreciate the clarity," I said. I turned back to Rossi. "May I ask a question before I respond?" Rossi spread his hands in a gesture of open generosity that did not reach his eyes. "Of course. The $33 million insurance claim that was filed for the Glass Cathedral, whose signature is on the policy authorization." A pause. Brief but present. Reeves's pen stopped moving. "That is a matter currently under review by the insurance carrier," Rossi said. "I am asking because the building's insurance policy was held jointly under Sterling Architecture Group and a Rossi Capital Partners subsidiary," I said. "Which means the claim authorization required 2 signatures, one from Julian Sterling as the firm's new majority shareholder, and one from a Rossi Capital representative." I looked at him steadily. "I am curious which representative signed." The quality of the silence in that room changed in a way that I felt rather than heard. Rossi looked at me for a long moment, with an expression I had not seen on his face before. Not anger and not surprise, but the careful reassessment of a man who has just understood that the person across from him knows more than he had calculated. Reeves cleared his throat. Mr. Sterling, perhaps we should schedule a follow-up meeting once you have had time to consider the settlement terms. I do not need more time, I said. I stood up. But I do need to use the restroom before I leave. It was a simple request. What it gave me was 90 seconds in the corridor outside the conference room, during which I passed 3 framed photographs on the wall building, projects, ribbon cuttings, Rossi shaking hands with various officials. In the third photograph, standing 2 people to Rossi's left, at what appeared to be a Milwaukee groundbreaking ceremony in 2019, was a face I recognized. I walked back into the conference room, thanked Rossi for his time, and left without touching the settlement document Reeves had placed in front of my empty chair. In the elevator going down, I took out my notebook and wrote down the name from the photograph before I could second-guess my memory. By the time I reached the lobby, I had called Elias. He answered before the second ring. "I need you to pull the permit records for a Milwaukee development project," I said. "Groundbreaking 2019. Rossi Capital Partners. And I need you to run the name I am about to give you against the Indianapolis case from 2021. A pause. "Arthur, what did you find?" "A thread," I said. "One that connects everything further back than either of us realized." Elias called me at 2 in the afternoon, while I was still in the car, heading south from North Wacker Drive. He had pulled the Milwaukee permit records within the hour, and his voice carried the particular flatness of a man who has confirmed something he had hoped would not be confirmed. "Raymond Voss," he said. "Independent certified public accountant. Licensed in Illinois, Wisconsin, and Indiana. He signed the financial verification documents for the Milwaukee groundbreaking in 2019. I am looking at the Indianapolis records now, and his name is on those too." I pulled out my notebook and uncapped my pen. What exactly did he verify? In Milwaukee, he certified the project financing structure, confirmed that the equity contributions from the development partners were legitimate and properly sourced. Same function in Indianapolis. A pause. "And Arthur, his firm is listed as the independent financial auditor on the Glass Cathedral insurance claim, the $33 million one." I held the phone against my ear and looked out the window at the city moving past. 3 cities, 3 projects. The same signature on every financial document that needed an independent third party to make the numbers look clean. Raymond Voss was not an accomplice in the way Derek Cole was an accomplice. He was something more systematic than that, a recurring element in a machinery that required at every critical juncture someone with professional credentials to stand between the fraud and the scrutiny. "Can you connect him to Rossi directly?" I said. "His firm has received consulting fees from a Rossi Capital subsidiary in each of the 3 years corresponding to the 3 projects," Elias said. "The payments are structured as routine advisory retainers, small enough individually to avoid automatic flagging, significant in aggregate. Layered payments," I said, "designed to look like ordinary business relationships." "Exactly. Which is why it took this long to surface." He paused again. "Petra Voss, the FBI agent Senator Briggs assigned to this, she needs to know about Raymond before her team starts building the federal case. If they find him independently good. If Rossi's people reach him first, and he disappears or recants, we lose the connective tissue between all 3 cases." Petra Voss was a name I had heard for the first time 2 days earlier. She was 52 years old, a financial crimes investigator with the FBI's Chicago field office, known within the department for a methodical approach to complex fraud cases that had produced 7 convictions in 11 years. Senator Briggs had specifically requested her by name when he made his call the previous afternoon. The fact that she shared a surname with Raymond Voss was a coincidence. I had already verified there was no family connection, and she had been informed of the potential conflict. She had disclosed it to her supervisor and remained on the case. I told Elias I would arrange for Marcus to brief Petra directly. Marcus had the financial documentation of the layered payments. He had been tracking anomalies in the firm's accounts for the past 8 months, without fully understanding what they pointed toward. Put together with Elias's permit records and Sloane's server files, it created a chain of evidence that ran from Rossi's office in Chicago back through 3 states and at least 6 years. Marcus called me 40 minutes later, and I understood from the first word that something had changed. "Someone accessed my files," he said. His voice was steady, but I could hear the effort that steadiness was costing him. "My personal financial records. Not the firm's accounts, my personal ones. The access came from an IP address I do not recognize routed through a server in Nevada. I had been expecting something like this since the day I asked Marcus to leave Chicago. Rossi's method was isolation, and isolation required intelligence gathering. If Rossi knew Marcus was still in contact with me, he would want to know what Marcus knew and what he was prepared to say. "Where are you?" I said. "Milwaukee, the hotel I told you about. Do not move. Do not access any of those files remotely. I am going to give you a number, and you are going to call it within the next 30 minutes. I read him Petra Voss's direct line, which Elias had forwarded to me that morning. "Tell her everything. The payment anomalies, the access breach, all of it. She will arrange protective measures. Arthur." His voice dropped. "How far back does this go?" I looked out the window of the car at the Chicago skyline, at the buildings I knew by their bones and their histories, and the problems each of them had solved. "Further than either of us knew when we started," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "And Leo, does Julian know you have the footage?" It was the question I had been carrying since the morning in the viewing room with Elias. I had not called Leo. I had not wanted to create a visible line of contact between us that Rossi's people could follow. But Marcus's question reminded me that Leo was 10 years old and living in his father's house, and that whatever Julian suspected or knew, Leo existed in the radius of that knowledge. I called Sloane immediately after I hung up with Marcus. She answered on the first ring. "Leo," I said, "I need him somewhere safe. Tonight." She did not ask for an explanation. "I know someone," she said, "a former colleague. She runs a residential program for at-risk youth in Evanston. Leo can stay there as a guest, no questions asked, and Julian will not think to look in that direction." A pause. "I can have it arranged in 2 hours." "Do it," I said. "Then Sloane, the server files you mentioned, the ones with everything." "Yes," she said. "How soon can you get them to Petra Voss?" The pause that followed was not hesitation. It was the pause of someone measuring the distance between where they had been standing for 8 years and where they were about to step. "Tomorrow morning," she said. "I need tonight to organize them properly. There is a sequencing to it. If Petra sees them in the wrong order, she will not understand what she is looking at." I told her I understood. After I hung up, I sat with the silence of the moving car and thought about all the things that were now in motion. Simultaneously, the FBI, the senator, the server files, Marcus in Milwaukee, Leo in transit, and Raymond Voss somewhere in the city, still believing he was invisible. 3 hours later, my phone rang. The number was one I did not recognize. I answered it anyway. It was Raymond Voss. Raymond Voss called from a prepaid phone and identified himself in the first sentence, which told me 2 things immediately. He was frightened enough to reach out, and he was not so frightened that he had lost the ability to make a calculated decision. Those 2 things together made him more useful than a panicked man and more dangerous than a loyal one. "I know who you are," I said, "and I know what you signed." "Then you know I am not the architect of this," he said. "I was brought in to verify documents that I was told were legitimate. By the time I understood what I was actually signing, I was already in deep enough that walking away had consequences." "What kind of consequences?" "The kind that involved documents in Rossi's possession that would end my career and my marriage," he said. "He keeps leverage on everyone he uses. It is how the machinery stays running." I had heard variations of this before, not from people in Raymond Voss's position, but from structures under load. Everything holds until it does not, and the moment before failure always looks from the outside like stability. If you are calling me, I said, you have already decided that Rossi's leverage is less frightening than whatever is coming. A pause. I received a call this morning from someone in Rossi's office. They told me the FBI had been making inquiries. They told me to be unavailable for the next 2 weeks. He exhaled slowly. Mr. Sterling, I have a daughter. She is 12 years old. I have been carrying this weight for 6 years, and I would like to put it somewhere that does not crush her when it lands. I gave him Petra Voss's number, made him repeat it twice, and told him to call within the hour and ask for protective cooperation in exchange for full disclosure. He hung up without saying thank you, which was fine. Gratitude was not what either of us needed from the other. At 8 the following morning, Dominic Reeves filed a civil lawsuit on behalf of Rossi Capital Partners against Arthur Sterling, alleging fraudulent misrepresentation in the original construction contract for the Glass Cathedral. The filing claimed Arthur had concealed known structural deficiencies that contributed to the fire damage. The claim was meticulous, professionally drafted, and entirely fabricated. But it was also timed with a precision that told me Rossi had been preparing it since before our meeting the previous day. He had walked me into his conference room, not to negotiate, but to observe, to assess how much I knew and whether I could be rattled. He had concluded I could not be rattled by a conversation, so he had moved to paper instead. I called Elias when I saw the filing. He knows the federal investigation is moving, I said. The lawsuit is a distraction strategy, Elias said. Force you to respond to civil litigation, consume your attention and resources, make you look like a defendant in the public record before the criminal case becomes visible. I know what it is, I said. What I need you to know is that it will not work. By 10 that morning, the accounting firm where Julian had been working as a senior associate released a statement confirming he had been placed on administrative suspension pending an internal review of certain documents he had authorized in recent months. The statement did not name the documents. It did not need to. Anyone familiar with the Glass Cathedral insurance claim would understand immediately which authorization was under review. Julian had signed his name to a $33 million fraudulent claim, and the firm's ethics committee had received an anonymous tip the previous afternoon. I had not sent that tip. When I asked Sloane, she looked at me with an expression that answered the question without words. Conrad Hale arrived at the Sterling Architecture Group offices at 11, a court-appointed auditor 58 years old, assigned by the civil court, in response to Rossi's lawsuit, to conduct an independent review of the firm's financial records. He was a compact, precise man, with reading glasses he wore on a chain around his neck, and a methodical courtesy that I recognized as the professional habit of someone who had spent decades in rooms where everyone was trying to manage his impression of them. He introduced himself to me in the lobby and handed me a copy of his appointment order. "Mr. Sterling," he said, "I want to be transparent with you. My mandate is to assess the firm's financial position as it relates to the civil claim. I follow the documents wherever they lead. That is all I would ask," I said. What Conrad Hale did not know and would discover within his first 3 hours of review was that the firm's financial records contained a trail that pointed not toward Arthur Sterling's culpability, but directly toward the systematic redirection of firm assets under Julian's management over the preceding 14 months. Every transfer, every reallocation, every account adjustment that Julian had made after taking majority control was documented in the firm's internal system with timestamps and authorization codes. Julian had been meticulous, which was precisely his weakness. Meticulous records of fraudulent activity are still records. I left Hale in the conference room with the firm's financial director and walked to the window at the end of the corridor. Outside, the city continued its ordinary motion traffic, pedestrians, the slow geometry of urban life proceeding without awareness of the machinery turning in the rooms above it. My phone buzzed. A message from Sloane, 4 words, files delivered to Petra. I read it twice. Then I sent 1 word back. Senator, tomorrow, ready. Her reply came in under 10 seconds. Everything is in place. But Arthur, there is one more thing you need to know before you walk into that room. I stared at the message for a long moment. Outside, a cloud moved across the sun, and the light on the buildings shifted from bright to something cooler and more considered, the way light does in October when the city is preparing for what comes next. I typed, "Tell me." The 3 dots appeared indicating she was writing. They stayed there for almost a full minute. Then they disappeared without a message arriving. She called instead. Sloane had told me on the phone the night before in a voice that carried none of the careful measurement I had come to associate with everything she said, that her father had not simply lost everything to Rossi. He had been positioned to lose it. The distinction, she explained, was the difference between a man who stumbled and a man who was pushed, and she had spent 8 years inside Rossi's operations and collecting the proof of that push. A document existed in the server files buried beneath layers of routine correspondence that showed Rossi had known about Richard Mercer's financial exposure before it became public, had accelerated it deliberately, and had ensured that the one signature Richard needed to save his firm was withheld by a Rossi-controlled intermediary. Her father had died believing he had failed on his own terms. He had not. He had been failed by a system that Rossi had rigged specifically for that purpose. I had sat with that information through the night and understood by the time the sun came up that what Arthur Sterling was about to walk into was not simply a federal hearing about arson and insurance fraud. It was the full accounting of a methodology, a way of dismantling people that had been refined across 3 cities and at least 15 years, and had never until now been assembled in one room, with enough witnesses to make it visible. The federal building on South Dearborn Street was quieter than I expected for a Tuesday morning. Petra Voss met me in the lobby at 8:45 with the composed efficiency of someone who had been awake since 5 and had no intention of allowing that to show. She was a trim woman with sharp gray eyes and the particular economy of movement that comes from spending years in rooms where wasted gestures have consequences. "Everyone is upstairs," she said. "Raymond Voss arrived 20 minutes ago with his attorney. Marcus Webb is already in the waiting room. Inspector Croft is with the senator." "And Julian," I said. She paused 1 step before the elevator. "He arrived at 8:15 with Dominic Reeves. They requested a delay. Senator Briggs denied it." The hearing room was smaller than I had imagined. A rectangular space with a long table, 6 chairs on the witness side, and Senator Briggs at the head, with 2 staff members flanking him, and Petra Voss taking the seat to his right. I sat at the near end of the witness table. To my left sat Marcus Webb, who nodded once when I sat down, but did not speak. Raymond Voss was 3 seats away, a compact man in his mid-50s with the look of someone who had not slept in several days and had made peace with that. Inspector Elias Croft sat at the far end, his evidence kit on the table in front of him. Sloane was not at this table. She was seated along the wall slightly behind the others in the position of a person who had brought something to a room and was waiting to be asked to present it. Julian entered with Reeves 2 minutes after the session was called to order. He was wearing a charcoal suit and the expression of a man who had decided that the best available posture was controlled confidence. He took the chair across from me. For the first time since the morning of the Ethics Clause meeting, we were in the same room. He looked older than I remembered. Not in years, in something harder to name. The quality of a face that has been carrying a weight it calculated incorrectly. Senator Briggs opened the session with a brief statement of scope and then turned to Petra Voss, who began with the evidentiary chain. She presented the materials in the sequence Sloane had recommended: financial documentation, first establishing the pattern of layered payments to Raymond Voss across 3 projects. Then the email chain from the USB drive which Briggs and his staff read in silence for 11 minutes. Then the permit records from Milwaukee and Indianapolis with Elias walking through the access log data from the Glass Cathedral. Julian's attorney interjected twice. Both times, Briggs overruled the objection with a patience that suggested he had been expecting them. Then Petra asked for the footage. The screen at the head of the table came to life. October 3rd, 8:47 p.m. Julian at the emergency panel. 11 seconds. The indicator light moving from green to red. The room was absolutely silent. I watched my son watch himself on the screen. His face did not change in the way I had expected. He did not flinch or look away. He watched with the strange stillness of a man confronting something he has known was coming for long enough that the arrival of it has lost the power to shock. What I saw instead, and I looked carefully because I am an architect, and I read structures, was something that looked in the half-second before his expression closed again, almost like relief. Reeves put a hand on Julian's arm. Julian shook it off. When the footage ended, Briggs looked at Julian directly. "Do you wish to make a statement at this time?" Julian looked at his attorney. Then he looked back at the screen, which had returned to black. Then very slowly, he looked at me. "I want to speak to the FBI independently," he said, "without counsel present." Reeves stood up. "Julian, I strongly advise." "I know what you advise," Julian said quietly. "Sit down or leave. Either is fine." It was the first time I had heard something in my son's voice that I recognized from a long time ago, a directness that had belonged to the boy. He had been before the years between us had accumulated enough weight to change the direction of everything. I did not allow myself to feel it fully. There would be time for that later, or there would not. Either way, this was not the moment. Sloane spoke for the first time when Reeves had left the room. She stood from her chair along the wall and addressed Senator Briggs, directly presenting the server files in the sequence she had organized, and then at the end the document about Richard Mercer. She read the relevant section aloud in a voice that did not waver, and when she finished, the room held the particular silence of people who have understood something that cannot be taken back. Briggs looked at her for a long moment after she sat down. "Ms. Mercer," he said, "how long have you been carrying that?" 8 years, 4 months, and 11 days, she said. By noon, the asset freeze order on Rossi Capital Partners had been signed by a federal judge. By 2 in the afternoon, Julian Sterling had given a full proffer statement to Petra Voss and 2 FBI agents in a private room down the hall. I did not hear what he said. I did not need to. I had watched 11 seconds of footage tell a story that no statement could revise. I walked out of the federal building at 3:17 in the afternoon into October light that was cold and clear and completely indifferent to everything that had just occurred inside. Elias found me on the steps. "It moves quickly from here," he said. "I know," I said. He nodded and went back inside. I stood on the steps for another minute, looking at the city I had spent 40 years building pieces of, and thought about all the structures that hold and all the ones that do not, and what the difference between them usually comes down to in the end. Vincenzo Rossi was arrested on the morning of October 18th at O'Hare International Airport, in the business class lounge of a flight scheduled to depart for Zurich at 9:15. He was accompanied by 2 attorneys and a carry-on bag containing, among other things, a laptop that the FBI had been seeking under a separate warrant for 72 hours. He did not resist. According to the account Petra Voss gave me afterward, he sat down when asked, folded his hands on the table and said nothing for 4 hours. It was, she noted, the most controlled surrender she had encountered in 20 years of financial crimes work, which told its own story about the kind of man he was, someone who understood, at the moment of capture, that the ground beneath him had been removed so thoroughly that no posture other than stillness was available. Dominic Reeves resigned from Rossi Capital Partners the same morning. Citing a conflict of interest, he declined to specify publicly. He did not take another client for several months afterward. Whatever he had seen in the documents during the preceding week had apparently been enough to recalibrate his estimation of what the next several years of his professional life were worth. Julian's proffer agreement resulted in formal charges being filed on October 20th: wire fraud, insurance, fraud breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy in the first degree. His accounting firm terminated his employment. The same afternoon, the charges were announced in a statement that was 3 sentences long and used the word regrettable twice. He retained new counsel and made no public comment. I did not call him. I was not ready for that conversation, and I was not certain I would ever be entirely ready. But I had begun to consider in the quiet of early mornings whether ready was a threshold I was entitled to wait for indefinitely. Conrad Hale delivered his audit findings on October 22nd. The report confirmed that Julian had redirected approximately $4.2 million of firm assets over 14 months through a series of internal transfers that had been authorized using credentials he had obtained legitimately and used illegitimately. The report further confirmed that the Sterling Architecture Group's intellectual property, the design library, the proprietary structural methodologies, the project archive had never been included in the share buyout agreement because it had never belonged to the firm in the first place. It belonged to me personally through the Delaware LLC and had done so for 11 years. Rossi's attorneys attempted to include the IP portfolio in their client's asset claims. The attempt lasted 4 days before a federal judge dismissed it with a terseness that Petra described to me as unusual even for that particular judge. Marcus returned to Chicago on October 23rd. He came to my apartment that evening with a bottle of wine he had been saving for an occasion. He had not been able to specify in advance, and we sat at my kitchen table and talked for 3 hours about everything that had happened, and several things that had nothing to do with any of it. At one point he said without particular emphasis that he had spent the past 2 weeks genuinely unsure whether either of us would come out of it intact. I told him I had spent about 10 days of those 2 weeks feeling the same way. He poured more wine. "What do you do now?" he said. I looked at the table. On it beside my glass was a yellow legal pad I had been carrying for the past week. On the first page I had written 3 words and stopped. Not because I did not know what came next, but because I was trying to be careful about what I committed to paper. I had spent 40 years building structures that outlasted the worst things I could imagine. I wanted the next thing I built to outlast something I had not imagined yet. "I don't know yet," I said, "but I have the pad." Leo came to stay with me the first weekend of November. He arrived on a Friday afternoon with a backpack and his drone in a carrying case and the particular solemnity of a 10-year-old who has understood that something significant has occurred in his family without having been told the full version of what it was. He set his bag down in the guest room and came to find me in the kitchen and stood in the doorway for a moment before he spoke. "Grandpa," he said, "are you okay?" I turned from the counter and looked at my grandson, this small, serious person who had flown his drone in the dark and handed me the footage without being asked, and who had, in ways he would not fully understand for years, helped save something that mattered. "I am getting there," I said. He nodded as though that were a satisfactory answer, which it was, and went to set up his drone on the kitchen table to show me a new flight path he had been practicing. Sloane left Chicago on October 25th. She sent me a text message the morning she left that said only, "It was enough. Thank you for being someone worth the 8 years." I kept the message. I did not have a response that matched the weight of it, so I sent back the only thing that seemed honest: "Your father would have recognized you." She did not reply, but the 3 dots appeared for a moment, before stopping, and I understood that as its own kind of answer. I walked past the Glass Cathedral on a morning in late October, a week before the demolition crew was scheduled to return. The building was still standing, temporarily reprieved, while the site remained an active evidence location under federal hold. I stood on the sidewalk and looked up at it in the early light, at the scorched facade and the blackened frames and the structure beneath them that had held when everything above ground level had been designed to fail. I had built it to survive the worst thing I could imagine. It had. That felt like something worth noting, even if no one else was there to note it with me. I took out the yellow legal pad and uncapped my pen. The first 3 words were already there from the week before waiting. I wrote the 4th. I spent 40 years building structures designed to outlast the worst things I could imagine. It took one night and one person I trusted completely to teach me that the most dangerous walls are the ones we never think to inspect. If there is one thing I would tell you, it is this: do not wait until the fire to find out what your foundations are actually made of. I waited too long. I trusted too easily. I called it loyalty when it was really just the comfortable habit of not looking too closely at the people standing nearest to me. That is the honest version of this father-family revenge story, not a triumph, but a reckoning. I am not a religious man by practice, but standing in front of what remained of the Glass Cathedral, I understood something I had no other language for. There is a grace that God gives to those who are handed enough time to make things right. I did not deserve that grace more than anyone else. I am simply grateful I did not waste it. My personal belief is this: betrayal does not begin with the match that starts the fire. It begins years earlier in small silences and small surrenders, in the moments we choose comfort over honesty. Every family revenge story's entry you have ever heard, including mine, starts exactly there. So here is my advice: do not be me. Do not let love become a reason to stop paying attention. Father-family revenge is never the story anyone plans to live. It becomes your story the moment you stop asking hard questions early enough to matter. These are the family revenge stories that stay with you because somewhere inside them you recognize a door you have stood in front of before. If any part of this reached you, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Your support is what keeps these father-family revenge stories alive. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. The stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted purely for reflection and insight. If that is not the journey you are looking for right now, no hard feelings at all. Step away, find what serves you better today. But for everyone else who is still here, I will see you in the next one.